So today I'm going to talk a little bit about noise reduction and sharpening. I'm going to talk about how to do it, when to do it, and we're going to showcase both Adobe, Photoshop, Lightroom, Classic CC, as well as ON1's brand new Photo RAW 2019. I have the beta version of that software that's releasing next month. So kind of fun to be able to showcase some of the first videos using that software. I've had a lot of people ask questions about when should I sharpen my images, when should I do noise reduction on my images, how do I do it? You know, and there's a little bit of an art to it. I'm going to kind of showcase the way that I approach it. This is Approaching the Scene. I'm Hudson Henry. It's a series of weekly videos that I put out every Thursday about all things photographic, from capturing better images in the field to editing your images better in the digital darkroom. And I really first and foremost want it to be a conversation, and that's why I really welcome all of your questions to join that conversation. So please send me more questions to questions@hudsonhenry.com, or you can put them up on the website really easily at www.hudsonhenry.com/ATS. You'll find a bunch of training materials there, from videos and courses to books and workshops, and there's a lot more coming in the very near future. So make sure you check that out. If you're enjoying these videos, please click like, please click subscribe, and tell your friends about it. So I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to start in Adobe Lightroom Classic CC. And I've got some images from a course that I shot this summer, the Approaching the Scene core course. It's kind of my fundamentals of photography course. And I've got a couple images in here that I'm going to use. It was all shot in Bears Ears, Moab, the Great Salt Lake, a great southwestern road trip. And I've got a couple images here to kind of showcase some principles about sharpening and noise reduction. And the first image that I want to take a look at in here is this image in a part of Bears Ears called the Valley of the Gods. And I've got my finished edited image right here, but I have the straight raw file with just some basic raw processing. I'm going to jump into Lightroom's develop module here. And you can tell that I've done some basic raw processing. I've adjusted the tone and color just a little bit on this image to kind of get it up and ready to finish edit, but I haven't done any detail work on it. I have done no noise reduction and sharpening. Now, at base ISO, at ISO 64 with this Nikon D850, I know I'm not going to have to do any noise reduction. You know, if I go ahead and zoom into this image, there's not really any noise to speak of in the shadows. It's nice and clean. But I could get more sharpness out of the image. Now, do I necessarily need to? And this image really answers that question about when do I need to do sharpening. And I'm going to say that for 90% of my images, I don't need to do any noise reduction or sharpening on them, because they're only going to be displayed digitally. They're going to be up on a website. They're going to go, on an Instagram post or a Facebook post. They're going to be displayed digitally, even if I'm going to put it in a smaller digital picture frame, to put up and display at, say, grandma's house if it's a family photo or something. You're not really going to notice whether or not you do noise reduction and sharpening. What's really going to matter is when you start making a larger print. You get up above 8 by 10, 16 by 20, bigger yet, you're going to really start noticing some sharpening benefits when you make larger prints, or if you're displaying on a really huge screen. If you're doing something for an installation where they're going to be putting it on a big HD screen, then sharpening could probably stand. It can help out a little bit. My general rule is that if I think I might want to print this image later, I'll do a little bit of sharpening at that raw processing stage. And I'll show you why. Here, if we zoom in to 100% on this image, and I go ahead and hold down the Option key. The Option key gives me a black and white view as I'm pulling the sharpening slider, and it's just a little bit nicer to view this thing without the confusion of color in the sharpening process. I think a simpler view just helps me watch these lines. Now, I don't want to over sharpen it. If I crank it way up, things look a little sharper than they maybe should, and I know that appeals to some people. I think over sharpening is an easy thing to do. Particularly as you start to do a lot of post-production in your image, you don't really want to overdo it. And as you pull that sharpening slider with the black and white view, holding the Option key on your keyboard, the Alt key on a PC, then you can pull the radius slider. And what the radius slider does is it indicates, how hard should the sharpening from the center of lines be? How intense is that sharpening? And that's something that in a portrait view is something you want to leave pretty minor. You don't want to make those edges really stand out in a portrait. In a landscape, you've got a little latitude to make that sharpening just a little edgier to make those edges pop. But if overdone, it's going to look really fake. And you don't necessarily want that. And I find holding that Option key and seeing that sharpening mask helps me make that decision. I can see all the detail in there and what's being sharpened and how much. Now, this detail slider is kind of a complicated thing that throws a few people for the loop. I like thinking of it as kind of a smart sharpening slider. And what it's going to do is it's going to add fine detail in to that sharpening mask. And if I hold down my Option key, I can see a mask of what's happening, and I can watch those little finer lines, in the rock wall here, get more intense or less intense. Now, the thing that you have to watch for is if you have noise in your image, this detail slider is not going to be something you want to use much in a portrait. Once again, it's going to show skin blemishes and things that you don't necessarily want to pop out in the in-focus part of your portrait in your portrait subject's skin. But in the landscape, it can showcase all the little grasses and fine details in your image. And this image doesn't have a whole ton of that's standing out. There's not like small blades of grass in the foreground to make stand out. But there are these fine little lines in the rocks. And the thing you have to be careful of is if you have noise in the image at a certain point as you start dragging this detail slider, you're really going to start crunching the noise and making kind of a crunchy look that doesn't look good. The noise is going to sharpen, and you're going to get that kind of gross look in smooth areas of the scene, like these skies and clouds, and you've seen that before, I'm sure, in other people's photos and even in your own. The detail slider I often leave over to the left if in doubt. In this kind of case, with such a clean base ISO image, I can crank it up a little bit to get a little more detail in these bushes and in the rocks. It's those fine details in the image that thing affects. And then finally, the masking slider tells us where we want that sharpening applied. At what level of detail are we going to add sharpening and not add sharpening? For example, we want the grooves in the road from the tires sharpened, but I don't want anything popping out in the sky being sharpened in this blue sky area. So I can just drag that thing until that level of detail that I want sharpening is getting hit. And then I'll take one more look at, is there enough sharpening going on or not? And again, I'm holding down the Option key, Alt for PC on every single move that I make in here, just because I'd rather see that masked view and I'd rather see the black and white view as I do it. Now, this image, it looks nice. Let's see if I turn this off. It's just not quite as razor sharp. And the place it's really going to show up is when you're looking at it with a fine eye to detail, like in a large print or a big display, as I've said before. It's really those applications where people are going to get in and see little fine details close up. On the computer screen, it's not going to make that much of a difference. Let me show you. So if I zoom out to a 100% view here, and we turn this sharpening on and off, you're really not going to notice a difference. So for those Facebook posts, for those Instagram posts, for those photos that you send to friends via email, if it's going to be displayed on a screen on a normal resolution or a higher resolution screen, not that big a deal. It's when it's going to be displayed on a huge screen for, say, a corporate installation or a big print. And by big, I usually mean, up in the 13 by 19 M bigger realm. You're really going to see an improvement in the print. You might even want to start practicing with it if you're doing even an 8 by 10. I think you'll see a little bit of a difference. So images that you might not otherwise even think need any sharpening can get a higher level of detail, particularly for printing. So that's where I'd say think about sharpening. Now, the next image I want to take a look at, I'm going to jump back into the library and go into the grid view here, is an image from Delicate Arch up in Moab, up in Arches National Park. And we did a little light painting one evening. And I've got the raw file here if I jump into develop. And I'm going to do this one in both Photo RAW 2019 and in Lightroom because there's a bit of noise reduction that we should do here too. And I've already done a bit here. I want to reset all those settings. Now I'll turn the sharpening all the way off here. I'll turn my noise reduction off. Let's start from scratch here. So let's see what this image, I've done a bit of raw processing. I really pulled back on the highlights, boosted the shadows. And one thing you'll find is that when you're boosting the shadows, here I'm working at ISO 800, even with a camera with good ISO performance like the Nikon D850, you're going to have some noise at ISO 800, particularly when you're pushing the shadows. And I see some pattern noise here in the shadows. So I'm going to go ahead, and the first thing I'm going to do when I have a bit of noise and I want to do noise reduction and sharpening, I'm going to turn off these little clipping guides because they're a bit distracting at this point. First thing I want to do, I want to go to a part of the image that has some noise in it and some detail in it. So I think this is pretty good. I've got interesting detail in the arch, and I've got some noise here in the shadows. And I want to just grab that luminance slider. And again, I'm going to hold down the Option key for Mac, the Alt key for PC. I'm just going to pull that noise slider, that luminance noise slider. And luminance noise is that noise that's in the pure kind of black and white noise. It's not color noise. I don't see any color noise in this image. I'll talk about color noise in a second. But I'm going to pull this luminance slider and just watch the sky, and it looks pretty darn clean to me. I can grab this detail slider, and the detail slider is going to kind of help me recover detail in the overall image, particularly up in these little rock areas. You pull it too much and you'll start recovering noise as well. So it's one of those careful little sliders to go with. Again, if you have any color noise in your image, holding that Option key down is going to let you isolate luminance noise from color noise, because you won't see the color noise in black and white. So you'll only be working on luminance noise. And then you want to go ahead up here and pull your sharpening slider up to where things are starting to look kind of nice and sharp. And we'll do the same thing we did a second ago with that image from Valley of the Gods. We'll pull our radius slider to kind of get the right amount of sharpening. We don't want to overdo it, but this isn't a portrait image, so we can go with a little bit. And kind of play one against the other a little bit. I'm a little concerned. I don't want to make this little swing of the loom cube that my friend Andy's doing under the arch too over sharpened, but I think it looks fine. And that might be something I want to knock out in post anyway. And as I take a look at the detail slider, again, it's not doing a whole bunch in this scene because we don't have a lot of high frequency light stuff. It's really going to show up in like a grassy field or a field of spring flowers that stretches right to the camera that's nice and sharp, and you want to sharpen all those little details like the blades of grass in the foreground of the scene. In this case, we don't have a lot of high frequency detail, so it's not doing a lot. But play with that in different images and take a look at different parts of the image. We could scroll around, and I just don't see a lot of area where that's going to be affecting anything. Maybe we could look right in here. Yeah, it's not making a huge difference. And then the last thing that I want to take a look at is masking. And when I do the masking with sharpening, there's a point where you're starting to see that I'm sharpening noise that still underlies the image. I haven't completely done enough noise reduction on the image. And as I draw this out, I want to get rid of the noise in the sky and only be sharpening the stars and the arch itself and what little bits of cloud there are in the scene. So that, to me, isolates the sharpening that I'm doing from any noise reduction I'm doing. Now, one thing I can do sometimes is it's kind of a test to see how good my noise reduction is. I can pull noise reduction just a little farther and see if I can back that masking down a bit without including any noise. And you can see I'm sort of doing this back and forth game. At this point, I'm not sharpening any noise because of pulling that masking slider. I've got the noise looking pretty good. Sharpening looks pretty good to me. I don't see any color noise. If I saw color noise, I would see sort of ugly green and purple kind of splotchy patterning, and pulling this color noise reduction slider would help a lot with that. I think I can back this all the way off and not see any color noise. That's just sort of a Lightroom basic built-in sharpening for landscape, I think, that's been applied there. So turning that off, I don't see any color noise in the image. I'm not going to worry about it. If I did see color noise, I'd start pulling that, and then again, I would pull the detail and smoothness sliders until I got detail back and a nice smooth look to that color noise. But again, that's only in really high ISO images generally. So now if you take a look at what this image looked like before and what it looks like after, a pretty big difference if we're printing. We've gotten rid of a lot of pattern noise in the shadows, and everything looks smooth, and we haven't lost a lot of detail. In fact, I think it looks sharper than it did before. But once again, if we back out of this image and we look at it at fit view on a digital screen, and this is a MacBook Pro's Retina display, turning off the noise reduction and sharpening, turning it back on, there's not any visible difference. So again, if you're not going to print this large, there's no reason to go to all the work for this noise reduction and sharpening. It's really just for your portfolio images that have noise. Do the noise reduction first, then do some sharpening. And these sliders all kind of interplay, and the noise reduction does its work by doing some little light blur to the fine details in the image, and so you need to do sharpening to recover the level of detail that you want, but you don't want to be sharpening that part of the image that's noise, so you move that masking slider to get rid of the finer details in the image. It's a total do-si-do sort of balancing game, and it can be really intimidating at first, but the more that you start just sort of messing around with it with your images, the easier it'll become. It's not ever going to be the same twice. Every different scene has a different lighting situation, a different level of noise that's going to pop up, and you're going to have to adjust those sliders separately for each and every different image. Now, if you photograph a whole bunch of images of exactly the same exposure on a tripod, you're going to be able to just sync those settings and it'll work just fine. But everyone, it's going to be a little bit different if you're photographing a different scene in a different level of light, even with the same camera. So one thing I'm going to talk about quick before I wrap this up is I'm going to jump into Photo RAW's brand new, ON1's brand new flagship software, Photo RAW 2019. I've got the beta running right here, and I'll do that same image in their edit panel. So it used to be, for those of you that are ON1 aficionados, that we had browse, develop, and effects. Now we have browse and edit, essentially, along with resize and some other cool stuff. And inside of edit, we now have non-destructive layers. We can blend multiple images and say, do a sky replacement from one raw file with another raw file non-destructively and create a third raw file that blends those two. And it's all kind of mind-bending. There's a lot to play around with. And we have a combination of things within the edit panel by tabs with develop effects. The old portrait module is back. The portrait app is here, and then local adjustments. And effects and local adjustments are all masked and layered workflows. I want to jump in here and develop in its basic raw processing and go into their details panel. And once again, we're going to zoom in. We're going to get a nice big close-up view of this image. And wow, even closer detail view. Well, we're at 100%. I'm not sure why Lightroom wasn't giving me as big a view. But we're going to look at this noise in the image. And I'm going to go in and do exactly the same thing. We've got some luminance noise here. First thing I want to do is hold down the Option key, same as in Lightroom, get that black and white view of what I'm doing. So I see no color noise in there. And I'm just going to pull that slider until it starts to look smoother to me. It's looking... It's not 100%, but it's looking smoother right about there. And then I want to go ahead, I'm going to pull the detail slider to recover some detail, and I'm particularly looking at these edges on the rock arch. I want to get some of that detail back that the blur has created without resharpening the noise that's in the image. And then I want to go ahead into my sharpening, still holding down the Option key here. And I'm just going to pull it up a bit. I often find for landscapes, I like somewhere right around in 50. I'm not looking at the amount on the slider. I'm looking at the image as I pull this. But as I look over, I see, sure enough, I've come to just about 50 there. And then I want to pull this threshold slider. It's just the same as the mask in Lightroom. And I can see I'm not really masking I'm not really sharpening any noise at this point. So I've got pretty good noise reduction. I might even be able to back that luminance noise down a little bit and check that threshold slider out, see what we've got going. It still looks great. So, it gives me a nice visual look at the noise that's in there. I don't see any color noise in this image, so I'm not even going to mess around with color noise. If I did, I could grab this, I could hold down the Option key and pull that color slider, and you'll actually get a really nice view here. I like the view in Photo RAW for luminance noise. You'll see splotchiness if there is color noise in there. I'm just going to leave it turned off because I don't see any. And if we take a look at what we looked at before, quite a bit of noise, particularly look up here in the sky. Turn it back on, we've really smoothed that out significantly, and you can tweak it to your own taste. But again, if we back out and we look at this image, turn it on, turn it off, not really going to see any difference in the digital representation on the small screen. So I'd say, once again, social media, sending smaller JPEGs via email, those things for 90% of your images that are just for sharing online, you're not going to need to worry about noise reduction and sharpening unless they're really, really noisy, in which case you could try to get them a little bit better. And anytime you're doing noise reduction, just remember sharpening is kind of the other side of that coin. Noise reduction is going to blur the image just a little bit to get rid of that noise. Sharpening is going to bring that level of detail back. Every single image is a little bit different. You're going to have to kind of mess around with those sliders. So remember, sharpen, noise reduction, look at the mask to see if you've got enough noise reduction done. If you've shot it at the base ISO and it's well exposed, there should be no noise. And so if you're going to print it large, just zoom in there to 100% and have a look and see if there's any more sharpness that you can squeeze out. If it's a raw file, I guarantee there is a little bit. So hope that helps a little bit. Again, you know, I love questions. I love having everyone who watches these approaching the scene videos join in the conversation. So if you have questions for next time, shoot them to questions@hudsonhenry.com. You can also log on to the website at www.hudsonhenry.com/ATS. If you enjoyed the video, please, you know, give it a thumbs up, give it a like, share it around, and subscribe. So until next time.